I first visited Washington, D.C. in 1966. I was 4 years old, and my family piled into our old station wagon and drove from our home in Rhode Island to our nation's capital. From my vague recollection, the trip was a bit like a biblical pilgrimage to see the hallowed sites of America's secular religion. In those days, one dressed up in one's finest clothes to romp around the hills of Mount Vernon, play in the marble halls of Congress, or if you were really lucky, and we were, to sit at the base of the pillars that held up the White House. In elementary school, I took a fifth grade class trip to Washington, my second visit. The lasting memory from that trip was when the hat blew off the head of one of my classmates at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Arlington Cemetery, and he instinctively ran into the enclosed area to fetch it. At that point, a uniformed guard in full dress regalia barked, "Halt!" and pointed his ceremonial rifle at my friend. All's well that ends well, but it was a memory I will never forget. 7 years later, in 1979, I came to D.C. for the third time on a trip sponsored by the Close-Up Foundation that brings high school kids to Washington from all across the country to see our political and policymaking process close up. Among all the brilliant politicians we met, I still remember a briefing from one especially wonderful journalist, Cokie Roberts, that laid bare some of the reality behind the luster of Washington. Sadly, Cokie passed away 2 years ago. And then in 1985, I moved to Washington after completing my master's degree at Harvard. And despite stints in England, Cameroon, and Morocco, I have never really left. The DC area is my home. My kids have known no other. I say all this to explain that over more than 50 years, I have seen Washington as a place to visit, as a place to work, as a place to live. I appreciate why it is our nation's capital, with an identity separate and distinct from the other 50 states. And I know firsthand the city as a living entity where hundreds of thousands of ordinary Americans live their lives as Americans do everywhere in our country. The time has come to recognize both these facts, to preserve something about Washington that is unique and distinct, and to provide its residents with the same rights and privileges that Americans everywhere enjoy. This is doable. I hope our legislators and our leaders get it done.